We're delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture with Dr Louise Fenton, which is Pitchfork Murders, Accusations and Suspicions of Witchcraft in Rural Warwickshire. And we're thrilled to welcome Louise Fenton back to host another of her fascinating lectures. And as usual, Louise has attracted people from all over the world. So we always have a global audience now, which is wonderful. My name is Paula Harrison, and I'm the coordinator of University Centre Telford. And we're part of the University of Wolverhampton, and we're based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. So we normally hold our public lecture programme in the centre in Telford, and Louise has been there a couple of times. But because of the current pandemic, we've moved all our lectures online. And as I say, that's been really, really successful. Just to say to you that we are recording tonight's event, and that will be uploaded to our University Centre Telford YouTube channel for you to view. But just to remind you that it is a public platform and the event is being recorded. Before I introduce Louise formally, I just wanted to explain that there will be a chance to ask questions at the end, and there is a Q&A button. If you're using a laptop or a desktop, that is at the bottom of the screen in the middle. And if you're using a mobile, it will be in the top right-hand corner. And we'd prefer you to use the Q&A rather than the chat, if that's all right, and then I can monitor that a bit more easily. So Louise is a cultural historian, illustrator and writer. She has a BA and an MA in illustration from the University of Wolverhampton. She completed her PhD on the representations of voodoo at the University of Warwick in 2010. And she's now a senior lecturer in contextual studies with us at the University of Wolverhampton. Her recent research has focused on the visual and literary representations of otherness and the social history of witchcraft, voodoo and zombies. So I'm going to hand over to Louise now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paula. Well, hello and good evening. I'd say it's lovely to see you all again, but obviously I can't see you. But for those of you returning, thanks for coming back to me. And for those of you who are new, I hope you enjoy the talk. I'm very enthusiastic about my subject, as anybody will testify to. But my name's Dr Louise Fenton. I'm an academic at the University of Wolverhampton. I'm based in the School of Art and Design. I have a background in art, but over the last nearly 20 years, my fascination has been with Haitian Vodou, New Orleans Voodoo, European witchcraft, more recently Icelandic witchcraft, curses, anything to do with the macabre, paranormal, spooky things, really. And thank you to Paula and to the University Centre Telford for hosting once again and the support they give me. For those new to Zoom, as I said, I can't see you at all. I have no idea who's out there. So if I crack a joke, I laugh. I don't know if you will be, or if you've dozed off, I can't wake you up. So put your feet up and let me tell you about this part of history in rural Warwickshire. Tonight, I'm going to talk about these two cases. And although there are sensational aspects, there are elements of morbid curiosity, of course, and then there is a need to tell these stories because I'm sure some of you have never heard about it, never heard about either of them. Some of you may be more familiar, but at the centre of these, we should remember that two elderly people were brutally murdered, and they're horrific cases, but they still attract a lot of attention. And what I want to do is tell both of the stories and explain what happened in both. And all of my research for these has been based on actual court transcripts, police files, newspaper archives, and other archival documents. So I haven't relied on secondhand testimonies. I've gone to the primary sources. So the two cases are both in Warwickshire. The first one is from 1875, and that was the murder of Anne Tennant in Long Compton. And then the second one I'll look at is from 1945, which was the murder of Charles Walton in Lower Quinton. This map shows where they are in Warwickshire. So the top left-hand corner is Lower Quinton, The bottom right-hand corner is Long Compton. They're about 13 miles apart. And if you imagine, if you follow that down diagonally further down, you get to Oxford. You have Stratford just slightly to the north east. Further down here, you have the Cotswolds. So it's quite central in Warwickshire, but it shows you how close they are. So first of all, Mrs. Anne Tennant was murdered on the 15th of September 1875 in Long Compton, Warwickshire. She was in her 80th year. I'm not sure, and there's some discrepancy over when her birthday actually was. Some records say she was 79, some say she was 80, but we'll take it she was in her 80th year. This is the row of cottages that she was believed to have lived in, or this was the location her cottage would have been. And around 8 p.m. on the evening of the 15th of September, she left her cottage. She was going to go and buy some bread. She'd run out of bread. She was just popping to the shops. The shop, these are the stores that are in existence. These are around late Victorian, so it's the same location as the store would have been. She took the small walk to the village shop when she was confronted by James Haywood, a 44-year-old farm labourer who was well known in the village. Mr. Haywood was holding a pitchfork and shouted at Mrs. Tennant, accusing her and others in the village of being witches. He stabbed her with the pitchfork in the head and in the legs, and he stood over her. Mrs. Tennant screamed and was heard by her family, her neighbours, who rushed out to help her. They thought she'd already died, but they carried her back to her cottage, and she passed away about 3 hours later. I'll talk a little bit about what actually happened and what James Haywood said at the time. But I think before I move on with this story, it's important to know that this is a village that's steeped in folklore and superstition. Just up on the hill outside the village are the Rollright stones and the King stone. And this stone circle is believed to be about 4,500 years old, and the King stone around 3,500. And it's believed to be a ceremonial circle, but there are lots of superstitions and stories attached to it. The shape of the King stone is a bit strange. It would have been more monolithic, but over time in the 19th century, tourists were coming to the area and cattle drovers kept chipping little bits off, and they kept them for good luck charms to try and ward off the devil. So this is, you know, it was superstitious times. And there are links to this and the legend of the witch and the king. And it's believed that a witch turned a king into stone, and the belief in witchcraft was quite commonplace. And this is mentioned in a 1906 book, which was Warwickshire. And I'm going to read, because this is in reference to Long Compton, and it's by Clive Holland. I'm going to try and hold it up if you can see me. It's a beautiful book, but it's just called Warwickshire by Clive Holland. So he writes of Long Compton: in the village, some interesting and ancient customs still survive, amongst which are the Christmas singers and the crowning of the May Queen. And even as late as 1875, the effect of ancient superstitions concerning witches and the evil eye was seen in the crime of a man named John Haywood. And throughout this talk, you'll understand that names are getting changed slightly and facts get slightly skewed. He stabbed to death with a pitchfork an old woman 80 years of age, exclaiming whilst he did so that he would kill all the witches in Long Compton and that there were 16 of them. At his trial for murder, during the course of his defence, he said, "If you had known the number of people who lie in our churchyard, who, if it had not been for them, the witches, would have been alive now, you would be surprised. Her, the deceased, was a proper witch." It came out in evidence that this man for years had honestly believed that when cattle or other animals died, or any evil fortune befell his fellow villagers, such things were the direct result of the evil eye of some unfortunate old women he asserted were proper old witches. His mode of killing the unfortunate woman he attacked was evidently a survival of ancient Anglo-Saxon custom of dealing with such persons by means of stackung, or sticking spikes into them, whilst at the same time wishing that the portion of the body so wounded might mortify or wither away. In the same year as Haywood's crime, a woman who died at Tysoe bore the reputation of being a witch and was so feared that one day some people came from the neighbouring village of Brailes, and this is in Warwickshire as well, with express intention of nullifying the effects of the evil eye she was supposed to have cast upon them by scoring her hand with a corking pin. Shakespeare himself, in the first part of King Henry VI, makes allusion to this practice in the speech of Talbot to Joan of Arc, when the former says, "Blood will I draw on thee, thou art a witch, and straightway give thy soul to him thou servest." So this is in 1906, recognising the fact that witchcraft and superstition was quite prevalent in the area. And so going back to this horrific crime. So Anne Tennant died on the 15th of September, 1875. And as was the process, the accused would appear in front of in this case, in front of the coroner, but it would be somebody who was important. So there would be a quarterly meeting of court in these rural locations, and it was to decide whether they should go to county court or a higher court. So it was called the Assizes Circuit. And in this case, it was the coroner's inquiry because it was held just 2 days after the murder. And it was held in the Red Lion pub in Long Compton. This is still there. I've been there 2 or 3 times. It's a very old, obviously, a very old pub. Still functioning as a pub. When things are lifted, you can go there for lunches, dinners. They've got rooms there as well. Beautiful place with a very darker history. So this is from the document on the 17th of September, which was for Anne Tennant of Long Compton. And this is about murder, James Haywood. So informations and examinations of witnesses taken upon oath the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1875, at the dwelling house of Edwin Wells, known by the sign of the Red Lion, situate in the parish of Long Compton, in the southern district of the said county of Warwick, before me, Thomas Barnes Couchman, gentleman, one of Her Majesty's coroners for the said county, assigned to act in the said southern district of the said county on an inquisition taken on view of the body of Anne Tennant, lying dead in the parish aforesaid. So this document, it's pages and pages of handwritten, which are beautiful, depositions and witness statements from everybody who was present, and this includes the one by her daughter, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, wife of William Hughes of Long Compton, the deceased was my mother. On Wednesday evening last, I went to call my boys in and then heard my mother scream twice and ran to her and tried to push her up, but I thought she was dead. She was bleeding very much. I'm sorry, the writing. I saw James Haywood there. He cried, "I'd done it, I meant to do it." Was then carried the deceased into my house, and there she died in my presence 2 or 3 hours afterwards. She was wounded in the temples and the legs. I have known Haywood many years. We were accustomed to hear him talk about witches, but took us no notice. And then there's just a cross, which was the mark of Elizabeth Hughes, Anne Tennant's daughter. So that's how shocking it was. It must have been horrendous for the family to have this happen to them, and to be accused of witchcraft. And it wasn't unknown for James to have often talked about witches. It was documented through most of the court documents, both in these statements by his family and then when it went to court. So James Haywood obviously confessed at the scene, but it went to trial. It went to trial 3 months after at Warwick Crown Court on Tuesday the 14th and Wednesday the 15th of December 1875. And it was held in front of Baron Bramwell, who was overseeing it. He was still adamant that Mrs. Tennant was a witch, and this was supported by his family. Both his mum and his dad both agreed that there were witches within the village, and it was quite normal for this. There was some question around his sanity, but I'll read first of all, just briefly, part of the court transcript. So his lordship: "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" Oh, I should say he started straight away. James Haywood started by saying, "I'd be sorry I hurt the woman, but she tormented me for a long time in witchcraft." So his lordship said, "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" James said, "I hurt the woman." His lordship, "He has to plead now and make his defence." Prisoner, "I did not kill the woman." His lordship, "Then you are not guilty." Prisoner, "I did not kill the person. Do you say not guilty?" And James replied by saying, "No, I say not guilty." So the plea of not guilty was then recorded. Now, some people had said that he was a wild man and that he was drunk. He used to drink a lot and race around like a madman. However, many others didn't think he was particularly strange in any way. The local policeman said that as far as he was concerned, he was a very quiet and peaceable man. His parents went to chapel every week without fail. And they think his religion was partly played a role in his actions, because he had a Bible and he'd marked many passages which related to witchcraft or actions of ridding the world of devil and witches. So there was a question around his mental health. Dr. Parsley, who was from an asylum, said he had examined James Haywood and found that he was of sufficient sound mind to understand the proceedings in court. He was a feeble-minded man, though thoroughly imbued with the idea of witchcraft. A surgeon at the jail, where he was temporarily held, said he considered that Haywood had insufficient brain power under a sudden impulse to control his actions. He would not consider an action wrong in the same light as a sane person would. However, it was down to the jury, and the jury consulted together for just a few moments. It didn't take very long before they returned a verdict of not guilty on the ground of insanity. And here you can see in front of you now on the screen, the sentence was to be detained in custody, jury of Her Majesty's pleasure. So it was basically for as long as necessary, not guilty on grounds of insanity. James Haywood, Long Compton, 15th of September 1875, for the wilful murder of Anne Tennant, now charged in coroner's inquisition. Now it seems that from this, Baron Bramwell commented the instance of witchcraft was obviously going to be in court. It was in all the transcripts. So he did make a comment at the end. He said he hoped that something could be done to disabuse the minds of the people of the village of the belief in witchcraft. It was a most mournful and melancholy state of ignorance. So that was his feelings on that. So James Haywood, what happened to him? He was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure at Broadmoor. And Broadmoor then had only been open for just 13 years. It opened in around 1863, 1862. And it was then known as a criminal lunatic asylum. And this is where he was. This is the old part because it's Victorian, it's been rebuilt and extended. Thankfully, we have many, many records, and this is the front of one of the books. This is Central London County Asylums and Hospitals from 1874 to 1876. And there are very thorough records, which is really useful. And I found this, which shows that James Haywood remained in prison for the murder of Mrs. Anne Tennant, and this is the record of his death. He's right in the middle. It says Haywood James, and it's got a C/1, which is in recognition of his death. And he died, it's recorded here, Broadmoor, 24th of June, 1890. I've seen his death certificate and it says he died the day before on the 23rd of June, 1890. And the cause of death was chronic abscesses and dropsy, which was edema, which was accumulation of fluid in his body. If you ever look up these stories online, there are many accounts that say that James Haywood died in Warwickshire jail, and that's where he spent his sentence, and it wasn't. He was definitely in Broadmoor, and like I said, I found all these documents, so that's where he spent his days. Some of the newspaper headlines at the time: strange murder of a woman in Warwickshire, alleged murder in Warwickshire, murder of a Warwickshire witch, murder near Shipston on Stour, a murderous lunatic, witchcraft. So you can see there's that kind of balance here in the press. This is all within the same year that the trial took place. So September was when the murder took place and the initial inquisition took place. And then the latter two, the murderous lunatic and witchcraft, were from December, which would have been shortly after the trial. Mrs. Tennant was buried at her local parish church on the 19th of September 1875. So that case was rounded up. It was quite clear who did it. He died at age 59. It still has resonance today. There are still relatives of Mrs. Tennant who are still researching her family history. Recently somebody was found and they've done a lovely job on piecing together chronology of what happened. But what's interesting is that 70 years later, another brutal murder took place, and that was that of Mr. Charles Walton, who was murdered on the 14th of February 1945 in Lower Quinton, Warwickshire, which, as I said, is about 13 miles away from Long Compton. This is a photograph of Mr. Walton, slightly younger than when he died because he was around 74, 75 when he was murdered. There are murder scene photographs. I'm not showing those this evening. They weren't in the files that I researched, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But this is who he was. Mr. Charles Walton was a very quiet man. He didn't go to the pub. He just lived in this little cottage. He was a farm labourer who worked for the Potters, and the Potters, L.L. Potter and Sons, were the farmers who owned much of the land in this village and surrounding areas, and many of the properties, including the cottage, which was lived in by Charles Walton. This is the cottage today, but originally it was 3 smaller cottages. So as you look at it now, Charles Walton lived on the far right side. So it would have been the 3 windows you can see on the right. That was his cottage when he was a farm labourer. It's now privately owned, and they bought the 3, and it's now one big property. He was a country man. He knew rural ways, and he knew rural tales and ways of the countryside, as would have been the way in that time. He lived with his niece, Edith, as his wife had died some years previously. And through my research on witchcraft, it's known that there were witch covens in the area, as there still are around Evesham and Stratford and this part of Warwickshire. But he had no known enemies. There is no evidence of him being connected to witchcraft at this stage. But again, as I just explained with Anne Tennant's murder, in the same way as Long Compton was steeped in folklore and superstition, so was Lower Quinton. Meon Hill, which is just outside the village, which you can just see here, you can see where it rises up. It was believed to have been created when in the 8th century, Evesham Abbey was being built. The devil was angered and took a clump of ground. Now, some people, in some tales, it says that he threw this clump of ground and it landed in Lower Quinton and formed Meon Hill. Some say he kicked a piece of land and it landed, but whatever, it was the devil that created this. Again, there's much superstition around witchcraft in the area. And there's a frequent sighting of the black dog. This has been documented really well in several books. But what's interesting is that it had an association with witchcraft and as transformational form. And it was believed in witchcraft as possibly the familiar of the devil himself, or as a guardian of the other world. And the inspector who came in to investigate this case, he records that he saw the dog, he saw a black dog, and shortly after it was killed by a police car and cows died. So there was superstition around in 1940s. And this was the end of the war as well. Remember that the war was still going on at this time. So on the 14th of February 1945, the alarm was raised by Charles Walton's niece Edith when he hadn't returned home. He was a man of habit. He used to go out to work. He'd always come home by about 4 p.m. Edith would leave him food on the table, and then she would return at about 6 p.m. On this occasion, he didn't come home. She called on their neighbour, Mr. Beasley, and said she was really worried. She was worried that he'd died or something had happened to him in the field of natural causes. So when they couldn't find him, they went out searching. They called around the village, still no joy. They went to call on Alfred Potter. And Alfred Potter was the man who employed Charles Walton. He was the son of the farm owners, the Potters. And he lived at Firs Farm. And he was the one who employed him. They went to where he had last seen him and they found his body. It was about 7 p.m. in the evening and the police were called. Edith was taken home and she was not allowed to see the body. So she was hysterical anyway, and there was no way they were going to let her. Here you can see this image. It's from Coventry Telegraph, actually, but these are the instruments that were used to murder him. So you can see the pitchfork with the two prongs, and then the bill hook or slashing hook, which was used for cutting back hedgerows. You can just see it lying on the floor with these aren't the actual murder weapons, but it gives you an indication of what they were like. The murder itself was brutal. He was an old man. He had a walking stick. Now, in some accounts, it talks about him being beaten severely with a stick. It didn't. I've read the post-mortem reports. He was attacked with the bill hook. He was attacked in such a way that he did try and fight back because there were cuts on his hands and his arms. But the hook, this really sharp knife, was used to slash his throat 2 or 3 times. Again, you'll read more sensationalized accounts which talk about decapitation and all the horrible things, but it's bad enough as it is. It doesn't need embellishing. So he was killed by the hook, and then the pitchfork was driven partly into his chest and across his shoulder. And again, it talks about being pinned down with it, but he was stabbed with that as well. There's a mention, again, in many accounts I've read, that he had a cross carved into his chest. He didn't. There was no indication of that whatsoever. He had his throat cut with the hook and then was stabbed with the pitchfork. And that's bad enough. It did appear he was quite dishevelled when they found him, as if somebody had gone through all his clothing, and his pocket watch was missing, which was really important to him. The next morning, this is the front cover of the report. You can just see at the top, it says Charles Walton, 75, require assistance in a brutal case of murder of A.M. another. So that was the cover of the file. That's the actual cover of the Metropolitan Police file. Suspicions were running high. This was the end of the war, and there was a prisoner of war camp that was just 3 miles outside of Lower Quinton. So this was the telegram that was sent. The Chief Constable has asked me to get the assistance of Scotland Yard to assist in a brutal case of murder that took place yesterday. The deceased is a man named Charles Walton, aged 75, and he was killed with an instrument known as a slash hook. The murder was either committed by a madman or one of the Italian prisoners who were in a camp nearby. The assistance of an Italian interpreter would be necessary, I think. Dr. Webster states deceased was killed between 1 and 2 p.m. yesterday. A metal watch is missing from the body. It is being circulated. Action. Deputy Chief Constable told that assistance would be forthcoming and that this office would telephone him shortly. So you can see that the finger of suspicion was directed straight away at the Italian prisoners of war. There was a response came from this from Scotland Yard that Chief Inspector Robert Fabian and another officer, which was Alfred Webb, would leave London and arrive forthwith. So they came on the overnight train. There were extensive investigations taking place, and there are thousands of pages of documents, of statements from witnesses. They interviewed all 493 inhabitants of the village, as well as going to the prison of war camp and interviewing the Italian prisoners of war. So it's thousands of documents. So I'll try and summarise and keep the points of the case. Although initially suspicion fell on the Italian prisoners of war, they could all be accounted for. They were very quickly eliminated from the inquiries because although there were boot prints at the scene, it didn't match what they were wearing. They weren't allowed out very much. They were allowed out to help labouring in the fields, but they had to return by a certain time, and they could account for every single prisoner during the time of the murder. So the day in question, Mr. Walton went to work early that morning, as he often did. He was hedge cutting and he was seen by a few people on his journey. So he always cut through the churchyard and then he walked up through the fields. Now, Mr. Alfred Potter, who was his boss, the son of the Potters, he was in his 40s at the time. He said he'd seen him at about 12:20. And I want to now focus on Mr. Potter's account. Not that I want to be biased, but this is a really important part of the case. Charles Walton was murdered between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. Alfred Potter initially said he'd been getting a cow from a trench that had died at the time of the murder. It later transpired that he did that at about 3:30 p.m. and not at 12 when he said he was. And it also turned out that the cow had actually died 2 days previously, not on the day. He then said he changed his statement, said no, he got it wrong. He'd gone home for a little while and he'd read the paper, but couldn't say exactly what time. He'd had some lunch, but he could not account for his whereabouts from 12:20 until after 1 p.m. During questioning, he explained that he knew where the body was as he'd seen him earlier, and he knew which part of the fields he was working, which was absolutely viable because he was his boss and he directed what he needed doing. But he incorrectly described what he was wearing, and it was almost as if he was saying he'd seen somebody else in the field. When the police then mentioned that fingerprints would be taken from the weapons, Mr. Potter then asked if he could change his statement again, because he said he thinks he may have touched the pitchfork handle to see if Mr. Walton was still alive or dead. Later that day, he went back again to the police station and said he needed to add to his statement once again because he thinks he may have touched the billhook as well. So suspicion was aroused, and as a result, the police asked Mr. Potter to give over all his clothes from the day of the murder. Now, this was the next day, so he'd had it overnight. So they were sent to the coroner for examination, but as can be seen by the document in front of you now, I have the honour to report that I examined the articles submitted by Detective Inspector Toombs on the 24th of February and labelled as belonging to Potter. So this is a week, nearly, 10 days after the murder. I could find nothing of evidential value upon these garments. There were 2 areas upon the breeches which gave presumptive tests for blood, but they had been so well cleaned that it was impossible to say whether or not this blood had been human or not. So it was inconclusive whether it was animal or human. The fingerprints turned out they couldn't get good fingerprints from either of the murder weapons. As time went on, this is a photograph on the right of Chief Inspector Fabian. He wrote an extensive report. This one's about 5 pages long, but there are several that support it. And within this document, which is in front of you, he states that and I'm quoting from his writing, the only person to whom suspicion attaches to any degree is Alfred Potter. And then at the end of the report, the Assistant Chief Constable is copied into a statement that concurs. The very thorough inquiries made into this case have so far uncovered no evidence on which action can be taken. There is suspicion on the farmer Potter, chiefly because of discrepancies in his statements. So there was just no evidence. There was no hard evidence. It was all circumstantial. There was nothing conclusive. It was just what they had put together, which was very little. Other than Mr. Potter constantly changing his statements, they had nothing. A watch was missing from Mr. Walton's possessions, as was a large sum of money. Now, this is quite interesting because when Mr. Walton's wife died, she had a life insurance policy, and he had £297 from that. And that was a lot of money then. It was quite a lot. Through these inquiries, Fabian found out that Mr. Potter was stealing from his parents' farm. He was responsible for paying wages to his workers. And what he was doing when he withdrew the money to pay the workers, he was drawing a little bit extra and pocketing it, which they found out about. It also transpired that some weeks he said he couldn't afford to pay Walton. He couldn't afford to pay Mr. Walton, so he'd have to wait 2 or 3 weeks for his money because generally it was weekly paid. There were rumours in the village that he'd borrowed money from Mr. Walton, but there was, again, no evidence. The fact that the clothes, Mr. Walton, when his body was found, his trousers were undone and his jacket was undone because he was known to have worn a money belt, which again wasn't on him at the time. But the case went cold. In Fabian's accounts, it was recorded that the villagers were not helpful in the slightest. Doors were slammed in their faces. No one would come forward with any evidence. No one was going to speak up. And it could be because the Potters were quite powerful in the area. They employed everybody, they owned the properties, so it could have just been fear. The farm's no longer there. This is where the farm stood. It's just new houses because the properties and land were all sold. In the 1950s, In the 1950s, the case was reviewed as links were made to Anne Tennant's murder, so the witchcraft started to come through. There was a surviving witness from Anne Tennant's murder, and Fabian decided to interview her. Even though she was a little girl at that time, she was questioned and the issue of witchcraft was raised, and he wrote about this quite a lot. Some believe that Mr. Walton may have been involved in witchcraft, but there was no evidence, just hearsay and rumours. In 1960, the missing watch suddenly appeared in the outbuildings of the cottage. They were clearing it all out, so it had been sold, and when they went to the outbuildings, they found the watch. And this was where Mr. Walton had lived. Again, witchcraft was mentioned because inside the watch there was a tiny piece of glass which was believed to be some sort of charm to reflect and to ward off evil. But many felt, some people said, oh, he must have just lost it there, but he was so habitual, a lot of people felt that it was suggested that the murderer had actually gone back and put it there to try and deflect any suspicion. There was one thing in the notes that said that the murder may have been a village conspiracy, that if Mr. Walton was involved in witchcraft, the whole village wanted rid of him, which again, no evidence. In the files, the photos and sketches are missing, although the photo of the murdered Charles Walton is available online. It's so frustrating to go to these files and find that people have stolen things from them, but that can be seen online. All of the physical evidence is now missing. So the photos of the scene of crime and sketches are missing from the files, even though you can find the actual murder picture online. Physical evidence has gone missing. I've been to, Scotland Yard and Warwickshire Police no longer have it. They say that they think it was, I think it was destroyed in a flood or something, because it did exist as late as the 1980s. Initial suspicion fell on the prisoner of war camp. 493 people in the village were interviewed. All of the Italian prisoners of war were found to be innocent. Very few witnesses would come forward and say anything about seeing Charles Walton. And all the suspicions were directed towards Alfred Potter, and that was because of the changing of the statements, him saying his fingerprints would be on all the murder weapons, and the blood on his trousers. This photograph was taken in the 1980s in Warwickshire Police, so you can see these are the actual murder weapons used to kill Charles Walton, and this is a detective who was looking into the case at the time. So it did exist, it's now disappeared. Newspaper headlines at the time still appear as this is unsolved. It is the only case that Chief Inspector Fabian did not solve. It's the only one that he didn't resolve. So at the time, hedge cutter dead in ditch, murder theory, Stratford murder, no arrest, the victim of the tragedy, slashing hook murder, murdered with a hook, slashing hook tragedy, the Quinton murder. And as you can see, in difference to Antennant, there is no mention of witchcraft. But what, I've put my glasses on because I've written really small on my notes. But what did happen was that when Fabian wrote his memoirs of this, he referred to this murder specifically as the Witchcraft Murder. And he wrote, I advise anyone who is tempted at any time to venture into black magic, witchcraft, shamanism, call it what you will, to remember Charles Walton and to think of his death, which was clearly the ghastly climax to a pagan rite. So towards the end of his career, he did actually think that this was something to do with witchcraft, and it was something to do with the superstition in the village. I'm going to just show a very short clip because I know we're running low on time. This was a documentary from 1971, The Power of the Witch. It's available on YouTube if you want to have a look at the whole thing. I'm just going to show a very short clip, which is about 3 minutes long, which is somebody talking about the witchcraft murder. But what's interesting, they interview Edith, who was Charles Walton's niece, and I think you'll find it interesting what she had to say. So as you can see, she just totally dismissed it and blew his theories out. And already, just 25 years later, they were embellishing the story with the cross cut in the chest and the thrusting of the pitchfork through his neck. So there were two significant crimes. I'm drawing this to a close now, but the memorials to both of these people in Long Compton, they've actually included Anne Tennant within the village. There's a millennium chronology that she features on. There's a village map which she features on. However, the facts are not quite correct, which is disappointing when she was part of the village. But in Lower Quinton, there is complete silence. There's no gravestone for either of them, but they are buried in their local churches. So as you can see, this is the millennium chronology, and underneath it, 1875, Anne Tennant was murdered in Long Compton, believed by her assailant to be a witch. So in order to honour her, they've put a witch's hat. So I do question some of these memorials. And again, there's a lovely map of the village. They've celebrated their village of Long Compton with all the traditions and the folklore. The rollright stones, this talks again about a witch. And it says, for more than 2,000 years, a king and his conquering army have waited for someone with powerful magic to break the spell that turned them to stone. The army, as the legend goes, had conquered all England as far north as Little Rollright. Marching up the hill on which the village stands, the victorious king met a witch who said, 7 long strides thou shalt take, if Long Compton thou canst see, King of England thou shalt be. Knowing that Long Compton was just over the brow of the hill, the king took 7 steps forward. Unfortunately, a mound obscured his view, and the witch cackled, as Long Compton canst not see, thou and thy men hoar stones shalt be, and stones they remain. So that's one of the myths around that. But this is the one that frustrates me, is because we've got a picture, the stereotype witch, cat and cauldron, even though Anne Tennant was accused of being a witch, there is no evidence whatsoever that she was. There were enough witches in Long Compton to draw a load of hay up Long Compton Hill, so goes an old saying. In 1875, an old woman in Long Compton by the name of Anne Tennant was killed by a local labourer, James Haywood, which is spelt different to his name. He believed she was a witch who had cursed him. He pinned her down with his pitchfork and brutally attacked her with his billhook. Well, of course, that's how Charles Walton died. We know that Anne Tennant was stabbed twice with a pitchfork. This was a traditional method of killing a witch, to bleed her and lessen her power. His fellow labourers pulled him away, but sadly, some hours later, she died. She was 79 years old. James Haywood claimed she led a coven of at least 15 witches in Long Compton, and he would have killed these other witches as well. He was found guilty of murder at Warwick Assizes and was admitted to Warwick Jail, where he died a few months later. So although they've acknowledged Anne Tennant's existence, many of the facts, as you know from what I've just told you, are very incorrect. It's a silent wall when I tried to talk about Charles Walton. This is the College Arms, which is in the village of Lower Quinton, and there is a book with the history of the village, but no mention of Charles. And when you try and speak to anyone, I spoke to the landlord and he just said, there are some things we just can't talk about or won't talk about. The villagers clammed up and said they either knew nothing about it or they didn't want to discuss it. They have been written about. In 1959, Donald McCormick, Murder by Witchcraft, which was Lower Quinton, and Hagley Wood Murder, which I haven't talked about. They're often brought together because of the nature of them. A body was found in Hagley Wood and she's known as Bella the Witch, but that's another talk. In the middle, and much later one, Paul Newman wrote Under the Shadow of Meon Hill, which is more about Lower Quinton and Hagley Wood murders, which does also mention Anne Tennant. Or most recently, Simon Reed's book, The Case That Foiled Fabian, Murder and Witchcraft in Rural England. So they have been written about, but the veracity of the content does vary quite a lot, as you've just seen on the map. So the facts are distorted, but these cases continue to intrigue. They've featured in many newspaper articles. They've been linked to witchcraft and to each other, but to this day, Charles Walton's murderer was not identified. But I think they'll still continue to hold that question, who did it? I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was fascinating as usual, and just so sad, isn't it? That
it is very, and I think that's the thing we forget. I've read the post-mortem reports for Charles Walton, and he was old, but he was a healthy old man and should have continued living his life in the same way as Anne Tennant.
Not to be remembered in the village. Very poignant, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Emma says, thank you for a great presentation, very engaging and fascinating. Please can you give the names of the areas again where the locals would have been suspicious of? And she says she's got the King's Stone.
So they're very suspicious of anywhere around Warwickshire. These are Long Compton and Lower Quinton. So those are the two villages I've talked about. But I think you'll find around the area, Evesham, the Vale of Evesham, I'm still in contact with covens in that area anyway. But the whole area is very much embroiled in witchcraft and superstition. But those two places in particular, I think it's worth looking at. And there's a place called Brailes, which is also just outside Long Compton.
Thank you. Rachel J says she missed a bit of the lecture and she's not sure if we've touched on this, but she's curious to know if we both believe in magic and witches, or are we just interested in the subject?
Okay, that's a tricky one to answer. I've worked with people who practice witchcraft for many, many years and voodoo practitioners. So I think we have to be open-minded, whether you believe or you don't. I started by just being interested in the subject, but I think you have to just be open-minded to it, because there are things in the world, the universe, that we can't explain.
Yes, and I would feel the same, and I just enjoy listening to Louise's lectures and hearing about her research. So thank you, Rachel, for the question. Kate, are the areas still seen as suspicious now? Definitely.
I mean, it's quite clear when you go to Lower Quinton. I always get Lower Quinton, where Charles Walton was murdered. People won't talk about it. They won't talk about the fact that witchcraft was even a possibility. And I think in a lot of rural villages, folklore and superstition are still very strong, and they're linked to the old ways, they're linked to the countryside ways, to traditions. And I think we have to celebrate that, because, you know, many of these traditions were ways of healing and helping people. They weren't necessarily harmful or sinister, but superstitions definitely. And it's interesting because where the rollright stones are and the King's Stone, there was recently, I think 3 or 4 years ago, they found a body of a woman and it had ritualistic objects with it, and that's fairly recently.
Oh gosh.
Because there were burial mounds up there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Well, a comment first of all. Thank you for a great talk. It's awful what happened to both people whose lives were cut short. What happened to Potter? She wants to know, and says, P.S. I live in Warwickshire and know all these areas and recommend the rollrights.
Well, you're very fortunate to live in such a beautiful part of the country, because the rollrights and that area of the countryside is so pretty. The Potters left. It was after this all died down, like I said, in the 1950s, there was a sudden little spike in interest when it was linked to Anne Tennant's murder, and Fabian went back to question again. But by the 1960s, the Potters sold up. They sold off their pockets of land, they sold their properties, and that's when they found the watch in the outbuilding in Potter's Cottage. So they disappeared. I don't know where they went. There are no, sorry, I'm jumping through. I've just noticed Maria's question, are the Potters still prominent? No, they're not. They went, there is no, I couldn't find any of their lineage. I mean, I've tried, obviously, being inquisitive as I am, I'm desperately trying to locate family members just to talk, but no, they disappeared. I don't know where they went, if there were any of their relatives that stayed. There were relatives, obviously, of Charles Walton, because in that interview in the 70s, that was Edith, who was his niece. She's since died, but she had children. So that lineage carried on. But no, they've gone.
Okay, thank you. Kyle says he doesn't know which is worse, to have your memory stonewalled or turned into a witch. Both crimes were against older people. So do you think that societal perceptions of elders played a part in the crimes, or press coverage of these?
Definitely. I mean, in some of the press coverage in the latter years after Charles Walton was murdered, at the time there was no mention of witchcraft whatsoever. But years later, Fabian published his memoirs 25 years after the murder. So that would have been about 1970. Then you've got this BBC documentary talking about this cross on his chest and embellishing what actually happened. You've then got later some newspaper records which say, you know, the witchcraft case that wasn't. And I think at the time, less so. I think there was more sympathy and empathy for the fact that these families had lost elder relatives. But as time went on, the media manipulated the facts and made them far more sensational than they needed to be, because they were horrific anyway. They didn't need to add and embellish. But I do think that perception of elders, because in later accounts I've read that Mr. Walton was knowledgeable of the old ways, that he held this mirror for a witch, that he practiced witchcraft, that, I mean, that whole thing about putting a little plough onto a toad's legs and letting it run across a field, you know, nothing of that was in any of the documents or accounts at the time.
Okay, thank you. Leah asks if there's any physical evidence of witchcraft practices in these villages, such as the poppets found in buildings in Cornwall.
Now, if those of you who've been to my talks, you know I'm very passionate about my puppets and curses, and that's a big area of my work. I haven't come across any puppets. There are witch marks that have been carved into some fireplaces that I know of in Long Compton. But again, if there was anything in Lower Quinton, nobody, it's a really strange silence. And it's been referred to as sort of a village conspiracy. I won't give up, obviously, and I will keep going, but nothing that I'm aware of in those two villages at the moment, other than one or two carvings in Long Compton.
Okay, thank you. Kim says, thanks for another insightful and inspiring lecture. Becky, she agrees with you about being open-minded. Even though she identifies as Christian, she has a healthy respect and curiosity for other belief systems.
And I think it's worth mentioning on that one, you know, I work a lot with Vodou practitioners and voodoo priestesses in New Orleans, and they're devout Catholics. They go to church, and I think, you know, with an open mind, these things can be balanced.
Yes, definitely. Deb says, thank you for another really interesting lecture.
Thanks, Deb.
Kyle has said, sad that neither of them have a grave marker.
There was a grave marker for Charles Walton after he died, but they found that every year on the anniversary of his death, the press and the media would just flock to his grave, and the family decided they wanted it to be more anonymous. And then about 20 years ago, they totally re-landscaped the churchyard and they took out all the old gravestones. So it's just disappeared now. So yes, it is a shame, because I think they should be acknowledged. I really do think they should be acknowledged. And I know, again, if you go online and research this, there is somebody who's taken a photo of a little stone that has CHW on it. It's not Charles Walton. People have written and said that's Charles Walton. That's, you know, sometimes you have a gravestone and then you have a footstone, which is just a little one with the initials and the date on. That's a footstone for a larger gravestone that was there. It may have been moved since I was last there.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's any more questions, but lots of comments in the chat. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Answers. Great talk. Much appreciated. Another great talk today. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, everyone.
Fab as ever. So, a couple more. Good talk. Thank you. Could you do a talk about Bella and the witch elm?
Absolutely. And perhaps that could be the next one.
Yes, sounds good.
It's a fascinating story. Again, another really interesting story with all the superstition around it.
And Kyle says thank you. So
thanks, Kyle.
Yes, lots of thank yous and lots of really positive feedback. So thank you very much, Louise. So if people keep an eye on University Centre Telford Facebook page and Twitter page, then you'll see when Louise is coming to do another talk with us. And we have got lots of other lectures coming up as well from Louise's colleagues. So you can join us for those as well. So thank you ever so much, Louise. That was absolutely fascinating as ever. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for attending. That was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.